Jessica Crow. I am the founder of Apogee and the host of Change Leader Insights, which is a podcast all about change management, change leadership, all of things related to change and leadership, essentially. I am really happy to have here with me today, Wendy Hirsch. She is an expert in partnering with people and organizations to fix things. I loved that, so I wanted to share that little soundbite. I'm going to read her bio, but then I'm going to have her introduce herself and tell a little bit more about her story and education. But as a coach and advisor, Wendy works with professionals who are dedicated to transforming their organizations, but rarely have the title change manager. That really resonates with me. Her work is informed by over 20 years in strategy and operations roles, reporting directly to C-suite executives, and supported by certifications in change management, project management and coaching, and mediation instruction. Wendy, I'm so happy to have you here sharing your wisdom. Thank you. And please tell us a little bit more about yourself. That bio was a kind of a quick hit on who you are, but there's definitely more to the story. Please share. And thanks again for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited for the conversation. One thing I'd say, which is just to clarify for everyone's benefit, is it's meditation, not mediation, which I would love to have that skill set, but I don't.
Wait, that's fun. I love that you have that too, because that's a topic that comes up on our Change Leader Insights as well. Thank you for clarifying, and apologies.
Yeah, no, not at all. And I'll say that, because change is so big, and even looking at your podcast and all the different eclectic voices, that the spirit in which I'll kind of introduce myself is that we stand where we sit. So really thinking about, why do I think about things the way that I do? Mm-hmm. And one of the big things I think is what you said in the introduction is that I've never held a role with the title of change manager. Mm-hmm. My thinking is a little bit more broad. I come from strategy, operations, usually do the same things, but some people tuck it into different places in the organization. Yeah. And so what that means for me in relation to change management or change leadership is I tend to bump things up a level. I'll tend to look at a more comprehensive end-to-end view. So I'm interested not in, sometimes we kind of say, I'm just doing the people side of change or something like that. To me, it's not so important what change management versus project management versus decision-making and data analysis. We kind of need all of it. So I'm a little bit less wedded to those things. And what I see as being important is the ability to really integrate so many different disciplines so that we truly can move from that current state to the future state. So that's one thing. The second thing I think, as I reflect on why I do and how I do what I do, is that I've worked in a lot of different places. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Haiti, developing microcredit. I worked in the Department of Defense with a lot of clients there, where I'm working for, officers in the U.S. Military and armed forces. I've worked in small organizations, large organizations that have tons of money, those that really don't have much of any, lots of ego and power, not so much. And what I kind of take from that for myself is that it's really important for me to hold on loosely to my approaches, but don't let go. The sense that I have to be able to meet people where they're at. Context is important. What people say is important, but I also have to be very clear with myself and even with my clients is, what is it about, the sauce that makes it special? So that is what has to be protected. And I think we can oftentimes, there's a wrapping on almost everything we can do. And I can take that wrapping off and wrap it up in a different way. But I really have to protect what we might think about, they call in implementation science, the effectiveness factors. And that kind of brings me to the third thing, kind of the third pillar, I think, of what I do is, as we've talked about, is this idea of having respect for both the science of what we do and understanding and really learning about the evidence around it, what works, what doesn't, or what don't we know, but also the art of it, and really trying to go back and forth between those two things. So much of the work I do now, Jessica, is really in coaching or consultative coaching, because I don't see it as being very helpful if I can just wow you by doing something really fast. It's really about you being able to have that experience of doing it and for us learning about that. That's gonna bring about the shifts within organizations. So those are kind of the three big things that I think just in full transparency will help people understand a little bit more of where I come from.
Yeah, absolutely. And leaning a little bit more into that conversation around the science piece, you kind of going back to when you were in school too, that started that, I think, interest in wanting to bring and bridge the evidence-based piece to the conversation, maybe more meaningfully. Is there anything you want to kind of expand on that as related to why having an evidence-based approach, the implementation science, is so incredibly relevant for people who are in your shoes and our shoes, who are leaders in organizations? Why is it something we need to be thinking about maybe more centrally than we are today?
Yeah. I think I'll say part of it is my disposition, right? So I've been known throughout my career as I'll always cite sources at the bottom of everything I create. So people becomes part of your brand.
Right.
But I'd say if it's not part of your brand or your interest, one of the things that I'd offer is simply the idea of we don't have to start from ground zero. My firm belief is almost everything that we're doing, somebody else has probably done, somebody else knows about it. And when we think about evidence-based management, there are actually 4 different types of evidence we might draw upon. And some of that is academic evidence. So we might look at journal articles and things like that, which is getting easier and easier to do. But the other thing is our own evidence in our organization. So if we have data in our organization, we want to take that versus kind of assuming things. We have our own evidence from our experience or the experience of others, which I'd note is different than people's opinions or preferences. It's their real experience. And then we have the values of the organizations, the stakeholders' perspectives. So when I say evidence-based approach, we can often think about just journal articles, but it really is about thinking more broadly of, other than my gut feeling or my opinion, what are the other things I can bring to bear on maybe what's the best way of making this work?
That's a really helpful clarification. Thank you for that. Leaning, talking a little bit about frameworks, or not having to reinvent the wheel because somebody's already done something. There's a lot of frameworks in change management that are out there. Some are more helpful than others. Do you have any perspectives on, and I know you have your own framework too, what are some useful frameworks or useful enough frameworks that if we are going to leverage them in the work that we do, recognizing that we do need to be pulling evidence in all the ways that you just described? Do you have any suggestions or recommendations on where people can start, or things that you found to be helpful as you've developed your own practice and methodologies?
Yeah, I mean, what I'd say broadly about frameworks is they're really meant to help us, I think, kind of cognitively hold all the different pieces and parts, right? Change is complex, so it's going to have a lot of different pieces and parts to it. And just to know that some frameworks are going to try and really capture that complexity. If you look at implementation science, I mean, some of those frameworks, they'll blow your mind because they're trying to show connections through everything, right? And for some people that really works. But the other thing is, other frameworks are just taking a piece of something. So I can find the analogy that's sometimes helpful for people is to realize that it's a flashlight. The framework is a flashlight, and it's going to illuminate pieces and parts of the picture. And just like when we're using a flashlight, we're going through the dark. We're not assuming that nothing exists if we don't see it. And I think it's really important to hold that, to know that I'm aiming this flashlight on this particular place. And if it's pretty narrow and strong beam, there's a lot else that's going on. And I'm not worried about that right now. And that's okay. But I have to acknowledge it's still going on. So I just say that broadly, and just to know that there are, I'll just offer this on my blog at wendyhirsch.com, or even if you just do Google Wendy Hirsch, Hirsch, and evidence, I keep this running list of different topics and pieces of evidence that are it's pretty valid, usually are meta-analyses, which are studies of studies. So we can get a good sense that we've pressure tested this idea. So I keep that there. So if you're interested in pieces and parts of that. And in that, Denise Rousseau, who is a professor at Carnegie Mellon and who has done a lot of work in both change and organizational change, but she's also kind of a real force around evidence-based management. She and colleagues have looked at a variety of times between business approaches to change, so what we might see in the popular press and what we might see in academics. So if you're interested in an evidence-based approach to change, I would kind of suggest you go to those places. My own framework is simply was looking across a variety of frameworks that come from implementation science. And I'll just offer for those who are not familiar with that term, I'm going to overly simplify and just say it's change management, but it comes from healthcare industry, social sciences, education. And it really is about saying, you know, we've got these practices that we know work to create outcomes for patients or outcomes for kids, outcomes for students. How do we get people to use them? How do we integrate them into what it is we do? And so it's really a discipline that looks at how do we translate science into organizations and get it to be actually working. So from there, you know, I looked across a variety of different frameworks there, and I tried to simplify it. I tried to make it a little bit more accessible. And it, you know, it's not something I sell. It's something I offer for free, mostly just because, as I said at the beginning, I'm pretty flexible about what frameworks we use or don't. I want to mainly be useful to people.
Yeah, no, I went and I was looking at it just today, actually. It's very helpful if you're new or even someone who has a lot of experience in change management, or you're a business leader. Taking a look at this can quickly help you think about how to approach a business challenge or an innovation and move forward in a way that allows you to be successful implementing whatever it is you're trying to implement, because it's like the guardrails almost for an approach. I think it's very effective. You talked about the flashlight effect of how frameworks take a look at a component of change or innovation. If you were to shine that flashlight on a particular area or starting point, what would it be for you?
Yeah. Well, I'll offer that one kind of piece of the literature that I find really useful, because it provides a variety of different lenses, is to think is what's called organizational fairness or organizational justice. And so if I can take a second to just explain what that is and why I think it's a nice starting point for people. So organizational fairness, organizational justice is it's linked with a lot of great outcomes in organizations during change, but also in general. Things like job satisfaction, kind of organizational commitments, my willingness to go above and beyond, organizational citizenship, like lots of great commitment to change, kind of what I think about my supervisor. So it's linked with a lot of great stuff when it's there. And there is the other reason I like it is that there is a really broad body of evidence that over decades, right, that has been really pressure tested. So we're able to say, gosh, I think there's some there in this. And so basically what it shows us is that people perceive fairness or justice in 4 different ways. So we might usually think about the first way, which is what they call distributive fairness or justice, and that's outcome. So if I'm going to change, a decision has been made, am I a winner or a loser in this, right? Am I gaining something or am I losing something in this? And people are going to judge the fairness of it, you know, based on, you know, are the outcomes of this decision, how are they impacting me? And that, you know, that makes a big difference for us. So if we use just that as a lens, why I like it for change is it forces us to think about, well, what is the impact that this decision is really going to have on people, right? And we might try to make it more equitable, but at the very least, we're thinking about the impact, and we might be thinking about there might be some loss there that we have to at least acknowledge if we can't completely diminish. We have a tendency to just go all in we're winning the benefits, and it's just balancing those. So, you know, it's a big deal. Distributive fairness is big, but there are other pieces which have been found to be, they're separate, they're different ways that people perceive fairness. The other big one is procedural fairness or process fairness. And that's the idea of, okay, this decision was made, the outcomes were what they were on me, but, you know, was it fair? Was the process through which these decisions were made fair? And there is also nice evidence around, well, what does it take to have a fair process? You know, part of it is, do we have clear criteria? Are they applied consistently? You know, we want to be free from bias. This might feel difficult. You know, it feels moral and ethical, but it's also correctable. So if there's something that we find is not right, it's accurate, and it's open to input. So you know, this is going to impact me. I have some chance of doing that. So we can think about, when we think about, gosh, the decision-making process that we're using, how we're engaging with people, what their opportunities are to kind of weigh in on that. Do we have clear criteria? Are we using them the same in all those different places? That's going to make a real difference into how people their willingness to accept the outcomes, even if the outcomes are not necessarily favorable to them.
Got it.
Those are kind of two lenses. And I'd say the third and the fourth, sometimes they're tucked together, are informational fairness and interpersonal fairness. So informational fairness is just, are we sharing kind of the why and how we did this? So we might have a great process, but we're just saying, we made this decision and move it, allowing people to kind of look behind the curtain a little bit and giving them the information they might need to understand, particularly the why around why this decision was made. And interpersonal fairness is about, are people being treated with dignity and respect? And while we would all hope that that happens all the time, I think most of us have the experience of change can be a little bit like a pressure cooker, and not the best, our best selves. It's not always the self that shows up. And so really thinking about that interpersonal fairness part of it is important. So I offer this. Why do I think it's nice? Well, when you think about fairness, if I can remember these four lenses, I can think about how I'm structuring a change, how I'm engaging with people in change. I can see, where is it that I would naturally do this? Where is it that maybe I'm not? So that it allows me to have a somewhat comprehensive, I mean, it's not holistic, but somewhat comprehensive way of engaging with change, but I don't have to hold too much in my head. Yeah, but I'd let you be you and your listeners be the judge of whether or not that is too much to hold in your head or not.
As you were describing that, I was thinking about David Rock's SCARF model. So I was more, I actually really appreciate that, because he talks about, I mean, it's that he developed it as a way for people to collaborate, thinking about everything that you just explained, fairness being one of them, but we move away from threats and towards reward. And so it definitely resonates. It does feel like any framework or approach that there's a lot of components within that. I mean, if I'm a leader in an organization and I want to start from that lens of fairness, and I'm thinking about all of these things, but the organization doesn't have some of the aspects that would allow us to, have fair process, have fair, interpersonal. Is there a starting point for any of those four that you would take a look at, or does it all have to work together? I'm just thinking, how do we break this down into even more manageable bites for leaders who are interested in doing exactly what you're recommending in terms of an approach?
Yeah. I'd say when you look at the literature, when they look across these different things, the big is going to be, am I a winner or a loser in this change, right? So if there's things that we can do to help people around that, but even when they control for that, then the idea of procedural fairness raises up. And we might say, I can't possibly do all of those things. But I would challenge people to say, if you don't have clear criteria, and if you can't say, how are you consistently applying these across, if I'm choosing between different ways to go in a strategy, why and how did I choose this versus that? This is a brief aside, but I'm hopeful that it's helpful. I collect a lot of news articles on changes gone wrong. And what I notice about kind of what happens often over and over, people say it's not really what they did, it's how they did it. I appreciate you have the right to make this business decision, but could you at least tell me why? And what really bothers people is if we don't just tell why. And maybe it's because we overlook the why, but I'll often think we can get ahead of ourselves and not even understand our why completely. So why is it that I chose this versus that? So if we're thinking about leaders of just, being very clear with yourself of what is it that has driven your choices, and knowing that it is very useful for people to understand that. Some people might bristle at the idea that we might owe and have a responsibility to people in our organization to share that. I'll leave that to others to decide whether that is. I think part of being a leader is kind of taking that part on. But in answer to your question, it's all important, but certainly the research shows that distributive and procedural kind of holds a lot. And then interpersonal, as much as you can think about, kind of maintaining yourself and your composure and your ability to do that so that everybody does feel respected in the process is very important.
Coming back to the idea of sharing that why, that resonates quite a bit. And there are going to be individuals in the organization that don't always agree with the why. if you have a client that is in that situation, and you've got good process and good interpersonal, how do you navigate that? Like, how would you coach or consult a client that is struggling to make a change because the majority of the individuals in the organization don't agree with the why behind the change? What are some strategies there that we could consider?
When I think about engagement, I think about two things which often come from the literature. One is sense giving. So I'm offering what I see. I'm offering information, I'm framing something, I'm saying, here's the why. The other piece is time for sense making. So I'm on the receiving end of that. I need to make sense of that for myself. I need to understand that. And in order for us to come to kind of shared understanding, we need to make space and time for both of those things. So all I'm saying related to what it is you offered is we oftentimes go in, well, this is my why, I understand the rationale. And do we provide enough time for people to say, gosh, this is how it's hitting me today versus how it's hitting me 3 weeks from now? What am I allowed to fill in the blanks of this? And can we have certain dialogue around that? I don't think we have to agree with every piece of feedback people offer us.
Yes.
I do think our ability to hold that feedback and respect that you're offering me that based on where you are, and I understand that the organization is moving in this direction, right? And I'm going to have space and time to understand where you're coming from, but we're moving in this way, and we can shape it to some degree together.
Really,
So
go ahead. Well, I was going to say, I love that you're saying this because I don't know if this happens often enough, that sense making time for that piece. I had a client a couple years ago where I had recommended a moment of self-reflection as part of this meeting we were having to do some of that sense making. And they were hesitant at first, but the meeting was going off the rails. And I'm like, well, let's just do this activity. And just allowing people to express their fears, concerns, make sense of what was happening, it served as a catalyst for us to move forward, because at least they could put it out there and start that process of thinking about things differently. Are you familiar with Theory U, the kind of the curve, the sense making curve? Okay, yeah, probably why. Okay, yeah. So that's a great tool as well to bring people together in that way and have those conversations. This is so informative. I can't wait to go to your website and take a look at all of the different resources you have there, and would strongly recommend anybody who's listening to this podcast or watching to do the same. Is there any other things that you think are worth sharing for people who are wanting to be in similar roles, coaching, consulting, leading change, or for even the business leaders who are preparing to implement a change within their team or across the organization? Any kind of final thoughts or tips or wisdom that that you've been thinking about as it relates to some of the work you're doing today that you'd love for others to know about?
Yeah, well, if I can take two. One is that there's this, I think it's a lovely idea from implementation science, and it's the idea of the complementarity of some of these things. And what that means, I basically look at it as we have to have them all to some degree, but we don't have to be rock stars at everything. Yeah. So the thing that I want people to understand is that, you yourself have strengths. And so it's important to, if you look at these frameworks and you think about these things, like, where do I as an individual, where do I shine? What is it that I'm really great at? And are there any of these that we still need as part of this, but maybe they don't come from me? Maybe we team up. That's why I often see team change is really a team effort. And it's just to say, you have to have some bit. You got to put something in on some of this. We can't have a zero in any of these categories, but just, take off some of the pressure that you have to be perfect at everything, because you don't. Your strengths will help to mitigate some of these weaknesses. So I just say that broadly, because I know it can feel like overwhelm. I've had decades to do this, and I try and keep that in my mind. It can feel overwhelming in terms of finding your entry point. The last thing I'll say, it's something that I'm just really interested in personally, if I could offer, is the work about, we talk a lot about people-centered change and the psychology part of it, which is super important.
Mm-hmm.
But Damon Santola and other folks who are doing work in like network science and thinking about how we actually, the structures of how people work together and how we, and thinking about how to structure those strategically for how behavior might spread in organizations. There's this really interesting work done on there. Like, if I could just briefly say, we often think about there's a hub and there's all these spokes. And so we find that key influencer and they help to spread everything. And what their research has shown is that works really well for information, but it doesn't really work well for behavior change because that's complex. It takes a lot more. So what we're looking more is for clusters of people. The other thing this is showing us is that we don't need to have 51% in order to get to our tipping point. It's actually much less than that. So the only thing that I have to offer, something that's very interesting for me, is really thinking through, hard and soft sides of things, but thinking through what can science start to show us about how we might want to think about how we're structuring, who it is we're targeting with change. Because we often just say, it's everybody. And there might be other ways of going about that. So that's something that I'm really interested in right now.
Oh, I'm interested too. Thanks for sharing that. And I'm sure you'll be sharing information on your website and LinkedIn. How can they find you on LinkedIn and follow your work and keep track of all the cool things that you're putting out into the universe so we can continue to learn from you?
Yeah, so I like to share this stuff. I like to have conversations on LinkedIn. So I'm not the most consistent sharer. I will try and work on that. But yeah, Wendy Hirsch, Hirsch. You can find me easily on LinkedIn and follow. And you can also find me on my website at wendyhirsch.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. I have learned a lot. I am motivated and inspired to go learn more and keep researching and doing that work for myself, because I know it'll help me be more effective in the engagements that I have with the clients and that I have. So I'm excited. Thank you again for your time today. Really grateful to have you on the show. And I have no doubt that the viewers and listeners are going to learn so much from this conversation. So yeah, thanks again, Wendy.
Oh, thanks for the invite. It was a real pleasure, Jessica. Thanks so much.
Thanks.